Hello, my name is Joe. This is my buddy Caden. It's basically like a little brother to me. He's here today because he has some questions about my faith. So I'm going to do the best job I can to answer them.
First of all, thanks for having me here, Joe. It's been a pleasure so far. My first question is, how do you know that Jesus is real?
Well, there are a lot of reasons why I believe Jesus is real. So I guess I'll start with the most basic one, and that is that we have 4 accounts of Jesus' whole life in the Bible, those being Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These accounts are extremely unique, and they're also very reliable. So I'll start with that by saying all 4 of these books were written around 30 years after Jesus' death, which is really important. Because if you think about that, if it was written 30 years after Jesus died, these people who wrote them were alive to either see Jesus die or hear about it from other eyewitnesses. So they are around when he died. And then on the flip side of that, if they were alive when Jesus died and wrote about 30 years later, that means other people were too. So if they truly were lying about this, or if they were making this story up, all the people who weren't Christians or who actually saw Jesus, not rise from the dead, or they did see him die, would very easily be able to just shut down these writings, because it'd be impossible to lie about something that everybody saw. So my second reason for why Jesus is real is how honest the Gospels are. If they truly were trying to lie about what they're writing, if it wasn't true, there's some things that are in there that just doesn't make any logical sense for why someone would put that in there. An example of this would be at the end of each gospel when the 2 women go to the tomb and they see Jesus isn't there. Mm-hmm. At that period in time in history, women held basically no social status in the world.
Important.
Yeah, they were not important. They were basically deemed unreliable, and no one wanted to listen to what they would say. So if you were trying to lie about something, why would you use women as an example in your story? Because people are going to see that as unreliable. So it only make logical sense if they are really putting women in their story if it was true. So that's my second reason. Final reason why I believe Jesus is real is the fact that we have other writings outside of the gospel that prove his existence. And these writings were written around the time that Jesus lived, and they were from writers who weren't Christian. So an example would be Josephus, who is a Jewish writer, and the writings of Talmud were writings of the Jewish people. And basically they don't recognize Jesus as the Son of God, but they recognize that he existed and they recognize that he lived. And that's huge because it shows that it's not just the Gospels that are, maybe someone would say they're making up Jesus' life. There's actually other writings, people acknowledging that a man named Jesus existed and performed
that aren't
miracles.
Christian.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense.
So do you have any other questions for me?
Yes, I understand that Jesus is real, but how do we know that he's a son of God?
So, if Jesus actually existed, right, so we got past that,
Yep.
he's actually a person, okay? That means he's one of 3 things. So if he lived the life that we believe he did,
Mm-hmm.
he's either A, a liar,
Mm-hmm.
okay, he lied about everything he did, or B, he's a lunatic, and he actually did think he was the Son of God, and he was crazy, or C, he was actually the Lord, and actually the Son of God. Okay, so let's break these 3 things down by logic, all right? So if Jesus Christ was really a liar, okay, and he wasn't the Son of God, is it really, how logical is it for someone to be captured by Roman soldiers, to give up his whole life, be flogged, be whipped, be beaten to the point of death, and then be crucified in the most painful way possible, and not just admit that you're lying? It doesn't seem very logical to anyone. So, along with that, Jesus also performed many miracles, which, had he truly been a liar, he wouldn't have been able to do. An example of that is Matthew 9:27-31, when he heals the blind men, and when he feeds the 5,000, when he cures the man of leprosy. He does all these things, and while he does them, there's eyewitnesses to these things happening. So people are able to see if he's actually performing them or not.
Mm-hmm.
And them seeing him perform miracles doesn't really sound like he's a liar. So that's the liar part. Okay, and that doesn't seem very logical to anyone. The next one would be, is Jesus a lunatic? Is he crazy? So the first thing I would say about that is, If you read the Gospels on almost an everyday basis, it seems like in Jesus' life, he was constantly in communication and I guess you could say discussion or argument with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who back in that time were arguably some of the smartest people around. They knew almost, you could argue, every word to the Old Testament. They knew everything, every theology, every book of the Old Testament in the Bible. And Jesus, who some people would say he was crazy, was able to stump them every day. Even with all their knowledge, he was always able to argue them and run them into dead ends. And so that just doesn't sound like someone who is crazy. If you're that intelligent and that smart, and you do it with so much love too that you prove a point to everybody else. And then another thing I would say is that, again, we'll go back to his miracles. A crazy person, can't perform miracles like that. And then finally there is the conclusion lastly, that he is Lord, that he is the Son of God, which, just speaking strictly logically, makes plain and simple the most sense. He wasn't a liar. He wasn't crazy. He didn't go through all that pain and suffering to lie about it. He wasn't that smart as a crazy person to be able to battle the Pharisees and perform all those miracles. He was simply the Son of God and Jesus Christ, our Savior.
Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you for clearing some things up.